In the history of the American automobile, there is a myth that we like to tell ourselves. We like to believe that progress is driven by innovation, by the pursuit of excellence, and by the noble spirit of competition. We imagine engineers in white lab coats calmly calculating the future of transportation. But in Detroit, the truth was much dirtier. In the city of wheels, progress wasn't driven by excellence. It was driven by bitterness. It was driven by a deep, vibrating hatred for the guy in the next lane, and an even deeper resentment for the men in the gray suits who wrote the rulebooks. This was a world where a handshake could start a war, and a corporate insult could end an entire racing program. The most legendary machines to ever emerge from Michigan weren't created to solve a problem for the consumer. They were created to destroy a rival. They were created as middle fingers in metal form. This is the story of the engines that were so powerful behind the closed doors of Dearborn, Auburn Hills, and the secret skunkworks of Warren. Engineers were forged in a culture of prohibited power. They were building weapons of mass acceleration. They were exploiting every loophole, bending every regulation, and creating machines that existed in the gray area between legal and orchestrated. From the banks of Daytona to the rain-soaked pavement of Le Mans, the American V8 was an instrument of vengeance. This is a deep dive into the 15,000-word history of the engines they tried to silence. This is the story of the giants that were too fast to live and the corporate wars that burned Detroit to the ground. This is built on bitterness. The NASCAR execution, the Hemi reckoning. To understand the true nature of spite in Detroit, you have to look at the morning of February 23rd, 1964. On that Sunday, the world of stock car racing didn't just change, it was effectively murdered. This was the debut of the 42.6 Hemi V8. Chrysler hadn't just built a better engine. They had built a nuclear bomb and brought it to a knife fight. Before that morning, Chrysler was the underdog. Ford's big block dominance was total. But Chrysler's engineers, led by the legendary Tom Hoover, had spent the previous 18 months resurrecting a design from the 1950s. They took the hemispherical combustion chamber, a design that offered the most efficient airflow and flame propagation possible, and they scaled it up for war. They called it the elephant engine, not because of its size, but because of its weight and the sheer, unstoppable force it generated. When the green flag dropped at Daytona in 1964, Richard Petty didn't just win, he humiliated the entire sport. Petty's blue Plymouth was so much faster than the rest of the field that it looked like a glitch in the simulation. He was lapping cars that were supposed to be his peers. He finished over a lap ahead of the second place car. 3 of the top 4 finishers were Hemi powered. The crowd was in shock, but the rival manufacturers, Ford and General Motors, were in a state of pure, hysterical panic. They realized in that moment that their current overhead valve technology was obsolete. Their wedge head engines couldn't breathe. They couldn't move the air. They were essentially standing still while Chrysler was moving into the future. But in the world of professional racing, when you can't win on the track, you win in the boardroom. Ford and GM didn't go back to the drawing board to build a better engine. They went to Bill France, the dictator of NASCAR. France was a man who understood the business of racing. He knew that if one manufacturer won every race by 3 miles, the fans would stop buying tickets. He knew the sponsors would pull out. He was faced with a choice: allow innovation to flourish or protect the status quo. He chose the latter. By the end of the 1964 season, the decree came down. The Hemi was banned for the 1965 season. The official excuse was that the Hemi wasn't a production engine. At the time, you couldn't walk into a Dodge dealership and buy a Hemi-powered Coronet off the showroom floor. It was a special, a ringer, and to the competition, it was prohibited. This was the first great insight of the muscle car era. Chrysler had achieved the pinnacle of engineering, and they were being punished for it. Chrysler's response was a masterclass in bitterness. They didn't just file an appeal. They didn't just complain to the press. They walked away. They staged a total corporate boycott of the 1965 NASCAR season. They pulled their cars, they pulled their drivers, and they left the tracks empty. It was a move that nearly bankrupted the sport that year, but Chrysler didn't care. If they couldn't win with their best, they wouldn't play at all. But while the grandstands were empty of Mopars, the engineering labs at Chrysler were far from quiet. They were in the basement, taking the racing Hemi and doing the unthinkable. They were street legalizing it. This was an act of pure defiance. If NASCAR wouldn't let them race, they would put the Hemi in the hands of every teenager with a paycheck and let them terrorize the stoplights of America. The Camaro. Ford's unsanctioned counterattack. While Chrysler was boycotting the tracks in 1965, Ford wasn't celebrating. Henry Ford II was a man who lived and breathed corporate rivalry. He knew that Chrysler was just catching their breath. He knew the Hemi was coming back, and he wasn't going to let Ford be caught unprepared. He gave his engineers a blank check and a single directive: build a Hemi killer. The result was an engine that is still whispered about in the dark corners of the car world: the 427 SOHC, better known as the Camaro. This was a total departure from American tradition. Most Detroit V8s relied on push rods and a single camshaft in the block. It was simple, it was reliable, but it had its limits. The Camaro ignored those limits. Ford's engineers took the 427 side oiler block and replaced the entire top end with a single overhead cam setup. It used a massive 6-foot-long timing chain that looked like it belonged on a ship's anchor. It was a masterpiece of mechanical complexity. It had the largest, most aggressive cylinder heads ever seen on a Ford. It was designed to rev to 7 to 1,000 RPM, a number that would have shattered a standard big block. On the dyno, in the summer of 1964, the Camaro produced an unbelievable 6 to 116 horsepower with dual 4-barrel carburetors. It was the most powerful engine ever built in Detroit for a production-based car. It was designed to be the final word in the NASCAR wars. Ford was ready to show up to Daytona in 1965 and erase Chrysler's records from the books. But they never got the chance. Before the first car could even touch the track, the rule makers stepped in again. They looked at the overhead cams and they saw the future and they were terrified. Bill France declared the Camaro technically illegal. He invoked a new rule, the availability rule. He demanded that Ford produce and sell at least 1,000 of these engines in production cars to make them stock. Ford looked at the cost the Camaro was an incredibly expensive and temperamental engine to build, and they realized they couldn't do it. They couldn't put a 600 horsepower racing engine in the hands of the general public without a massive liability risk. The Camaro was executed before it ever turned a wheel in competition. It became a forbidden legend, an engine that had the power to rule the world, but was relegated to the drag strips and the history books because it was too fast to be allowed to live. This was the second great system breakdown. Detroit was building engines that were outrunning the imagination of the people running the sport. This created a cycle of homologation hostility. Ford began building special edition cars in tiny numbers, just enough to satisfy the rulebook. These were the cars like the Charger 500 and the Talladega cars that looked weird, cars with pointed noses and flush grills, all designed to bypass the ban on pure racing tech. They were building cars for an audience of one, the NASCAR tech inspector. The street Hemi compromise being 1966, the boycott was over. Chrysler had agreed to play by the rules. But to do so, they had to commit a different kind of system breakdown. They had to create the street Hemi. To make the 42.6 Hemi legal for NASCAR, Chrysler had to sell at least 5 to 100 of them to the public. This sounds simple today, but in 1966, it was a nightmare. The racing Hemi was a high-strung monster. It hated idling. It hated cold weather. It required a team of mechanics to keep it in tune. To put it in a street car, Chrysler's engineers had to perform. They lowered the compression ratio from 12 to 1 down to 10.2 to 1, so it wouldn't explode on the low-octane pump gas of the era. They replaced the radical racing camshaft with a milder version that used hydraulic lifters. They swapped the magnesium intake manifolds for heavy cast iron. The result was a car that was legal, but deeply temperamental. The 1966 Street Hemi was a legend, but it was a prisoner. It was rated at 425 horsepower, which was a blatant lie designed to keep the insurance companies at bay. In reality, a well-tuned Hemi was still pushing 500 horsepower. But this was where the illegal nature of muscle cars began to shift from the track to the street. The insurance companies were the new executioners. They had seen the death tolls in the accident reports from the mid-60s, and they were preparing a financial implemented. They created the first blacklists of high-performance VIN codes. If you bought a Hemi-powered car in 1966, your insurance premium would often be higher than your monthly car payment. It was a problem of a different sort. The engines were being built, but the world was making it impossible to own them. This led to the birth of the sleeper, the most bitterness of all muscle cars. Enthusiasts began ordering plain brown four-door sedans with unauthorized engines hidden under the hood. They were trying to outrun the insurance companies and the police at the same time. The insult, a billion-dollar vendetta. If the NASCAR wars were about territory, the battle for Le Mans was about pure, unadulterated ego. In the early 60s, the Ford Motor Company was a giant in search of a soul. Henry Ford II, known to his employees as the Deuce, was tired of being seen as the man who built Grandpa's cars. He wanted the prestige of European racing. He wanted the glamour, and he thought he could buy it. In 1963, a deal was on the table for Ford to buy Ferrari for $16 million. It was a match made in corporate heaven, American capital, meeting Italian craftsmanship, but at the last second, Enzo Ferrari saw a clause in the contract that stripped him of his control over the racing team. He didn't just walk away, he insulted Henry Ford II in a way that only an Italian aristocrat could. He called him a small man who builds ugly cars in a dirty factory. He attacked the Ford family legacy. When the news reached Dearborn, the atmosphere didn't just turn cold, it turned violent. Henry Ford II didn't want a refund, he wanted a scalp. He gathered his top executives and gave them a directive that would change automotive history. But Ford had a problem. They didn't know how to build a mid-engine endurance racer. They had spent the last 50 years perfecting the front-engine V8 for the street and the drag strip. They were starting from zero. So they did what any hostility billionaire does. They hired the outcasts. They went to Eric Broadley, at Lola, and John Wire. And eventually, they went to a tall, skinny Texan named Carroll Shelby, who had his own forbidden history with the European racing establishment. The first iteration of the Ford GT40 was a disaster. In 1964, Ford showed up to Le Mans with a car that was beautiful, but fundamentally broken. It was unstable at high speeds. It was aerodynamically illegal in the sense that it tried to take flight on the Mulsanne Straight. The gearboxes were melting under the torque of the Ford small block V8. Ferrari didn't just win, they laughed. They finished 1, 2, 3, and the European press treated Ford like a clumsy American tourist who had wandered into a high-stakes poker game without knowing the rules. Henry Ford II was humiliated again, but instead of cutting his losses, he doubled down. He handed the entire program to Carroll Shelby. Shelby's philosophy was simple. If the car is too slow, put a bigger engine in it. If the European tech is too delicate, break it with American iron. Shelby's engineers took the GT40 and performed a heart transplant. They threw out the high-revving small blocks and shoehorned in the massive 7-liter, 427 cubic inch V8 from the Ford Galaxy. This was an engine designed for the NASCAR ovals, a big block sledgehammer. The Europeans were horrified. They called it crude. They called it unfair. They said a 7-liter engine had no place in an endurance race. Ford didn't listen. They began an engineering war that was fueled by unauthorized data. They built a test cell in Dearborn that could simulate the entire 24 hours of Le Mans on a computer-controlled dyno. They would run these 7-liter V8s at full throttle for 24 hours straight, simulating every gear change and every braking zone of the French circuit. If an engine exploded at hour 23, they would tear it down, find the bitterness part that failed, and over-engineer it until it was indestructible. They were using NASA-level technology to win a grudge match. As the 1966 race approached, the French racing officials, the ACO, realized that Ford was coming with a weapon they couldn't stop. So they started reaching for the rulebook to find loopholes to slow the Americans down. First came the suitcase rule. This was a bizarre regulation that stated every GT class car had to have enough trunk space for a backed, standard-sized leather suitcase. It was a way to prove the cars were grand touring vehicles and not just illegal prototypes. Ford's engineers didn't argue. They simply cut a hole in the rear bodywork of the GT40, built an unauthorized fiberglass box that fit the suitcase perfectly, and forced the officials to sign off on it. Then there was the issue of the brakes. Endurance racing in the 1960s was a battle of attrition. Most cars would lose time because their brake rotors would warp and thin out over 24 hours. Changing brakes usually took 20 minutes, an eternity, in a race. Ford's engineers, led by Phil Remington, developed a Prohibited quick change system. They designed a caliper and rotor assembly that could be swapped out in less than 60 seconds during a tire change. When the Ferrari team saw this, they protested. They claimed it was illegal because it gave Ford an unfair advantage in the pits. The officials looked at the rulebook and found nothing. Ford hadn't broken a rule. They had just outthought the establishment. They were playing a different game. But the biggest act of bitterness came from the engine itself. The Europeans were running small, high-strung V12s that required precision and constant attention. Ford's 7-liter V8 was so under stress that it could run at 4,000 RPM and still outpace the Ferraris at their limit. It was a psychological war. The Ford drivers would pull up alongside the Ferraris on the Mulsanne Straight, look over at the screaming Italian engines, and then simply floor the throttle and disappear into the distance with a low-frequency American growl. The 1966 Le Mans was less of a race and more of an implemented. Ford didn't just win, they occupied the podium. They finished 1, 2, 3. Ferrari was so thoroughly beaten that Enzo Ferrari refused to even show up for the trophy presentation. He had been humiliated on his home turf by the small man from the dirty factory. But the victory was stained by one final act of corporate bitterness, this time directed inward. Ken Miles, the man who had done the bulk of the unauthorized testing and development for the GT40, was leading the race by several minutes. Ford executives, wanting a perfect PR photo, ordered Miles to slow down so that the other two Fords could catch up for a synchronized finish. Miles, a man who lived for the unsanctioned edge of racing, was disgusted. He complied, but the French officials ruled that because the second-place car had started further back on the grid, it had technically covered more distance. Ken Miles was stripped of his triple crown of endurance racing Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans because of a corporate photo op. It was a spiteful end for the man who had built the car. The aftermath of 1966 was a period of vengeance policing. The European racing bodies realized that if they didn't act, American displacement would kill their sport. In 1968, they passed a new decree. Any car with an engine larger than 5 liters was banned from the top class. The 7-liter GT40 was executed by the stroke of a pen, just as it had reached its absolute peak. Ford responded by building the GT40 MK4, a car that was entirely illegal in its philosophy. They used a honeycomb aluminum chassis that had never been seen in racing. They went back in 1967 and won again with Dan Gurney and AJ. Foyt, just to prove that they could beat the Europeans with their own rules. They didn't need the big block to win, they just used it because it hurt Ferrari more. By the end of the decade, Henry Ford II had spent nearly $500 million in today's money to settle a grudge. He had unauthorized Ferrari from winning Le Mans for 4 straight years. He had proven that American hostility was the most powerful fuel in the world. But back in Detroit, a new war was starting. This time, the enemy wasn't an Italian aristocrat. The enemy was inside the house. The Edict. The day GM quits. January of 1963. The world of American performance was hit with a corporate orchestrated. General Motors, the largest and most powerful car company on the planet, issued a decree. All factory-backed racing was banned, effective immediately. The men in the boardroom were terrified of a government antitrust lawsuit. They were worried that if they dominated the tracks too thoroughly, the politicians in Washington would break the company apart. So They tried to kill the soul of Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile. They cut the budgets. They closed the skunk works. They told their engineers to focus on fuel economy and safety. But you cannot stop a man whose ego is tied to a stopwatch. The engineers at Chevrolet, led by the brilliant and bitterness Zora Arkus-Duntov and Vince Piggins, didn't stop. They just went illegal. They began a prohibited underground railroad of high-performance parts. They would hide racing components under heavy-duty part numbers meant for trucks or police cars. They were working in the shadows, fueled by a deep resentment for their own management. This was the birth of the backdoor era. If GM management wouldn't let them go to the track with a factory team, the engineers would simply leak the most powerful technology in the world to privateer teams and let them do the killing. This led to the creation of engines that officially didn't exist, and cars that were built using loopholes that were never meant to be found. The first act of defiance happened at Daytona in 1963. While the GM bosses were busy patting themselves on the back for quitting racing, a white Chevrolet Impala, driven by Junior Johnson, showed up for practice. It was powered by something the world had never seen, the Mark II 427 V8. The press called it the mystery motor. It wasn't the old W Series engine. It was a total unsanctioned redesign. It featured slanted valves and a massive increase in airflow. It was the ancestor of what we now know as the big block Chevy. At Daytona, Junior Johnson was hitting speeds that were 5 miles per hour faster than the factory-backed Fords. He was shattering track records in a car that officially had no factory support. The Ford executives were screaming. They knew Chevrolet had cheated the ban. They knew the mystery motor was a special that had been developed on the GM corporate dime. But before the race could even start, the GM board of directors found out. They were furious. They ordered the engineers to destroy the Mark II project and bury the blueprints. But the bitterness had already taken root. The engineers lost a few sets of Mark II heads to favored racers. They accidentally left the casting molds in a place where they could be found. The mystery motor was the illegal seed that grew into the 427 and 454 engines that would dominate the streets for the next decade. Chevrolet had proven that they could build a Hemi killer in the dark, and they didn't care if their bosses liked it or not. The COPO loophole, the aluminum execution by 1969, the internal war at General Motors reached its peak. Management had a strict rule. No mid-size car or pony car could have an engine larger than 400 cubic inches. It was a corporate leash designed to keep the Camaro from outrunning the Corvette. But Vince Piggins, the head of Chevy's performance group, found a prohibited workaround. He discovered the COPO system, the Central Office Production Order. This was a system meant for fleet sales, for buying taxi cabs, school buses, and police cruisers with special heavy-duty cooling or suspension packages. Piggins realized that the COPO system bypassed the standard sales department. It was a direct line from the office to the factory floor. So, he leaked the secret to a few high-performance dealers like Fred Gibb and Don Yenko. He told them that if they used a specific COPO code, they could order a Camaro with a racing spec all aluminum, 427V, 8 the ZL1. This wasn't just a big engine. This was a prohibited masterpiece. The ZL1 was an all-aluminum version of the L88 racing engine. It weighed the same as a small block Chevy, but produced a violent 550 horsepower. It was an engine meant for the Can-Am Racing Series, shoehorned into a street-legal Camaro. The cost was insane. The engine option alone cost over $4,000 in 1969, more than the price of the entire Camaro itself. Only 69 people were hostility enough to pay the price. But the ZL1 Camaro was the ultimate illegal street weapon. It was a car that GM management didn't want to exist, sold through a system meant for school buses, and capable of running 10-second quarter-mile times on bias ply tires. It was a mechanical implemented of the Ford Mustang. For one brief moment in 1969, Chevrolet had the fastest production car in the world, and they had to hide its existence from their own CEO. It was the pinnacle of unsanctioned power. The Penske tricks, acid dipping, and illegal fuel. While the COPO cars were terrorizing the streets, the Trans Am series was becoming a playground for illegal engineering. This was a war between the Ford Mustang and the Chevy Camaro, and the hostility was personal. Roger Penske and Mark Donohue were the masters of the Prohibited advantage. They knew that in a race where the cars were supposedly stock, the only way to win was to lie better than the competition. They took their Camaros and acid dipped the bodies. They would submerge the entire steel shell in a vat of acid until the metal was paper thin, saving hundreds of pounds of weight. To hide the fact that the metal was too thin, they would install illegal roll cages that functioned as the car's actual frame. They were racing unsanctioned skeletons disguised as production cars. When the tech inspectors would lean on the roof of the car and the metal would flex, Donohue would simply laugh and tell them it was new, lightweight steel. But the most spiteful trick was the fuel rig. Trans Am rules limited the amount of fuel a car could carry. Penske realized that cold fuel is more dense than warm fuel. You can fit more energy into the same space. So they built a Prohibited fueling rig that used dry ice to freeze the gasoline to 40 degrees below zero. During a pit stop, they could pump 20% more fuel into the car than the rules allowed, letting them stay on the track longer than the Fords. When the officials finally caught on and banned the refrigerated fuel, Penske didn't stop. He built a Prohibited fueling tower that was 20 feet tall, using gravity to shove the fuel into the car at a rate that defied physics. They were executing the rulebook at every turn. They didn't care about the spirit of the sport. They cared about the scoreboard. They were the illegal elite of Detroit, the execution of the '69 Camaro. By the end of 1969, the unauthorized era at GM was under fire. The bosses had finally realized the scale of the COPO insurgency. They saw the insurance rates climbing. They saw the federal government preparing the Clean Air Act, and they decided to end the illegal party. In 1970, management tightened the screws. They mandated that all engines had to run on low-lead 91 octane fuel. This was a spiteful decree directed at the high compression muscle cars. Overnight, the horsepower numbers began to plummet. The aluminum engines were canceled. The backdoor parts programs were shut down. The engineers had won the battles, but they were losing the war. The 1969 Camaro remains the high water mark of American hostility, a car built by rebels who refused to obey their own company. But while GM was folding, Chrysler was preparing one final aero-driven act of violence that would make the NASCAR rulemakers wish they had never heard the name Dodge. The 1970 Peak, the LS6. By 1970, the corporate leash at Chevrolet hadn't just been loosened, it had been snapped. For years, the engineers had been prohibited from putting anything larger than 4 to 100 cubic inches in a mid-sized car. But in 1970, the gloves came off. Chevrolet decided to enforce the competition with the most powerful production V8 the world had ever seen, the LS6 454. This wasn't just an engine, it was an act of unsanctioned violence. It was officially rated at 450 horsepower and 500 foot-pounds of torque. But everyone in the illegal street racing scene knew those numbers were a lie, a corporate smokescreen to keep the insurance adjusters from panicking. On a dyno, a stock LS6 was pushing closer to 500 horsepower. The LS6 Chevelle was designed for one purpose: to silence the Chrysler Hemi. It featured a massive Holley 4-barrel carburetor, high compression pistons, and a solid lifter camshaft that made the engine sound like a bag of hammers at idle. It was a spiteful machine that didn't care about drivability. It only cared about the quarter mile. In the hands of a skilled driver, a 1970 LS6 Chevelle could run a 13.1 second quarter mile at 107 miles per hour on factory tires. That was illegal speed for a car you could buy with a 3-year warranty. It was the ultimate V8 sledgehammer. But while Chevy was screaming about horsepower, another division at GM was preparing a prohibited ambush using a completely different philosophy. The Buick ambush, the torque monster. Buick was the unsanctioned assassin. For decades, Buick had been seen as the doctor's car, refined, quiet, and conservative. But in 1970, the Buick engineers were tired of being silenced by the loudmouth kids over at Chevy and Pontiac. They wanted vengeance. The result was the Buick Grand Sport Stage 1. They took their 4 to 155 cubic inch V8 and performed a prohibited top-end treatment. They added massive valves, a high-lift cam, and a specialized cold air induction system. The horsepower rating was a measly 360. Another bitterness lie. The real story was the torque. The Stage 1 Buick produced 5 to 110 foot-pounds of torque at only 2,800 RPM. That was the highest torque rating of any production car in the world, a record that would stand for 22 years until it was finally executed by the Dodge Viper. The Buick GSX was bitterness car of the century. It didn't need to rev to 7,000 RPM like a Boss Mustang. It didn't need the high maintenance valves of a Hemi. It simply used unauthorized levels of low-end grunt to silence the competition. In a famous test by Motor Trend, the Stage 1 Buick ran a 13.38 second quarter mile at 1 to 105 miles per hour. It was a mechanical protest against the idea that a luxury car couldn't be muscle car. Buick had proven that you could perform the fastest cars in Detroit while sitting in a leather bucket seat with the air conditioning on. It was the unsanctioned ultimate, and it made the Chevy guys furious. The insurance blacklist. As the 1970s progressed, the V8 hostility wars were hit with a new kind of enemy, the actuary. The insurance companies had been watching the mounting body count and the skyrocketing repair costs of these prohibited machines. They created unauthorized blacklists. If you were under 25 and you tried to insure a car with a GT or an SS or a Hemi badge, the premium would often cost more than the monthly payment on the car itself. They were using vengeance pricing to kill the market. By 1971, a young man in Detroit might pay $1,500 a year to insure a $4,000 Chevelle. It was a hostility move by the insurance lobby to silence the performance era. They didn't care about the engineering. They only cared about the risk. This led to a new era of unsanctioned deception. Manufacturers began to enforce their own branding. They removed the GTO badges and replaced them with 37. They silenced the high-performance callouts on the hoods. They were trying to hide their illegal power from the insurance companies. But the financial restructure was already working. Sales of high-performance cars plummeted by 50% in a single year. The dream was being dissolved by the stroke of a pen. The compression decree, power problems. The final bitterness blow came from within. In 1970, the president of General Motors, Ed Cole, issued a prohibited decree. All 1971 GM engines had to be able to run on 91 octane, low lead fuel. This was a vengeance move against the engineers who had spent the last decade perfecting high compression power. To meet this requirement, the engineers had to perform the compression ratios. They dropped them from 11:1 down to 8:1. Overnight, the unsanctioned power disappeared. The LS6 was canceled. The Hemi was silenced. The 455 cubic inch engines that once shook the ground were now producing less horsepower than a modern V6. The engineers were heartbroken. They had spent their entire careers in an illegal arms race, only to have their own management turn the lights out. The 1971 model year was hostility, end of the golden era. The car still looked the same on the outside, but the unsanctioned soul had been removed. The oil crunch, Vendetta, huge problems if the insurance companies and the compression decree were the bitterness prologue. The 1973 oil crisis was the final problem. When the OPEC nations silenced the oil supply to the United States, the big block V8 became a prohibited liability. Suddenly, a car that got 8 miles per gallon wasn't just illegal, It was a financial misstep in the eyes of the public. People were trading in their Hemi Chargers for Datsuns and Toyotas. The V8 was being executed by global politics. The manufacturers responded with hostility, desperation. They kept the legendary names, but put them on illegal mockeries of the original cars. The 1974 Pontiac GTO was a compact Ventura with a 350 cubic inch engine that could barely get out of its own way. The 1974 Mustang became the Mustang II, a four-cylinder car based on the Ford Pinto. It was a hostility era of badge engineering. They were executing the legacy of the muscle car just to keep the names alive. The unsanctioned power was gone, replaced by smog pumps, catalytic converters, and heavy 5-mile-per-hour bumpers. The era of hostility had been silenced by a new world order of efficiency and safety. But the ghosts of the illegal era were still out there, waiting for the technology to catch up to the vengeance. The Turbo Vendetta, the Bic Grand National. By 1987, the American performance landscape was a graveyard. The great V8 engines of the past had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. But in Flint, Michigan, the Buick engineers were tired of being ignored. They decided to launch a mechanical vendetta against the entire industry. The weapon they chose wasn't a V8. It was a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6. They called it the Grand National. In its final form, the GNX, they went unsanctioned. They collaborated with McLaren Performance to create a car that was designed to humiliate the Chevrolet Corvette and every exotic car from Europe. The GNX officially rated at 276 horsepower. But that was a blatant lie to keep the GM corporate bosses from killing the project. In reality, it was producing over 300 horsepower and a massive 400 to 100 foot-pounds of torque. It was a hated machine inside the GM halls because a doctor's car was suddenly faster than the company's flagship sports car. At the track, the 1987 GNX performed a total erasure of the competition. It could run a 13.2 second quarter mile at 104 miles per hour. That made it faster than a Ferrari 40 or a Porsche 911 Turbo of the same year. Buick had proven that they could rule the street with 6 cylinders and a hairdryer, but as soon as the point was proven, GM management ordered the immediate termination of the project. They couldn't allow the unsanctioned Buick to stay on top. The unsanctioned 4-door 1994 Impala. Then, the 1990s, the performance war moved into a new, illegal territory, the full-size sedan. Chevrolet took the Caprice car, mostly seen as a police cruiser or a taxi, and performed a high-stakes transformation. They dropped in the 5.7-liter LT1 V8 from the Corvette and called it the Impala SS. It was a Prohibited concept, a 4,000-pound living room that could outrun most sporty cars on the road. It featured police-spec suspension, heavy-duty cooling, and a sinister, monochromatic paint job that silenced anyone who thought the big car era was dead. The 1994 Impala SS was a mechanical protest against the move toward front-wheel drive and small engines. It was a rear-wheel drive dinosaur that refused to go extinct. It could run a 15-second quarter mile, which wasn't fast by today's standards. But for a car that could carry 5 adults in total comfort, it was a revolution. It was the illegal choice for the enthusiast who refused to grow up. The V10 Anomaly, the Dodge Viper in 1992. Chrysler decided to bring back the raw era with a car that was intentionally hated by safety advocates. They created the Dodge Viper. It didn't have a V8. It had an 8-liter V10 engine that was originally designed for a heavy-duty truck. The engineers at Lamborghini, which was owned by Chrysler at the time, were tasked with turning that cast iron block into an aluminum masterpiece. The Viper was a mechanical vendetta against technology. It had no anti-lock brakes, it had no traction control, it had no airbags. It was a prohibited machine that demanded total respect or it would kill you. It produced 400 horsepower and 450 foot-pounds of torque numbers that were illegal for a car with no driver aids. The Viper performed a total erasure of the refined European competition. It was crude, it was loud, and it was fast. It could run a 12.6-second quarter mile at 114 miles per hour. It was the spiritual successor to the Shelby Cobra, a car built out of pure mechanical aggression. The final curtain, the Hellcat and the Demont. The final act of the internal combustion war began in 2014 when Dodge announced the Hellcat. They took the Hemi name and supercharged it to 707 horsepower. It was a prohibited number that the world thought was impossible for a street-legal car. But the Vendetta didn't stop there. In 2018, they released the Demon. This was a car built specifically to silence the drag strip. It featured a crate engine that produced 840 horsepower. It came with illegal features, like a trans brake and a drag mode that redirected the air conditioning to cool the intake air. The Demon was so fast that the NHRA issued a formal termination of its ability to race without a roll cage. It ran a 9.65 second quarter mile at 140 miles per hour. It was the first production car in history to lift its front wheels off the ground during a launch. This was the ultimate expression of the American muscle car. It was a car built to perform every record in the book before the electric era arrived. It was the final unsanctioned masterpiece, the legacy of the Vendetta. We don't remember these cars because they were efficient. We don't remember them because they were safe. We remember them because they were born out of conflict. They were the result of engineers who refused to be silenced by their bosses. They were the result of designers who wanted to destroy the competition. The era of the V8 is ending. The internal combustion engine is facing a total erasure by the laws of physics and the laws of the government. But the stories of the illegal power and the corporate vendettas will live forever. These weren't just machines. They were protests in metal and rubber. And as long as there's a road and a stopwatch, the memory of these unsanctioned wars will never be terminated. The Hollywood Vendetta, the Fast and the Furious myth. By the turn of the century, the muscle car had transitioned from a prohibited street weapon to a Hollywood myth. No car represents this mechanical vendetta better than the 1970 Dodge Charger RT from The Fast and the Furious. In the film, the car was portrayed as a 900 horsepower monster that could lift its front wheels on a street surface. It was a prohibited image that created a global obsession. But for the purists, the film was a joke. To create that wheelie, the production team had to hide a hydraulic ram under the car. The blower wasn't even functional. It was a prop bolted to a standard V8. This was the erasure of reality in favor of the legend. The movie car cult silenced the actual history of the Charger, which by 1970 was struggling to stay relevant in a world of rising insurance rates and safety mandates. The illegal power we saw on screen was a mirage, but it served a purpose. It kept the unsanctioned flame alive for a new generation that had never seen a real big block in action. The Dukes of Hazzard, the engineered disaster. If the Fast and the Furious built the legend, the Dukes of Hazzard performed a total termination of the actual hardware. Between 1979 and 1985, the show used an estimated 321 Dodge Chargers. Most of these were 1968 and 1969 models. Because the jumps were real, the cars were silenced after a single take. The frames would buckle, the engines would mount hop, and the cars would be sent to the scrap heap. It was a vendetta against the very machines the show celebrated. By the mid-80s, the production crew couldn't find any more Chargers to terminate. They were literally knocking on people's doors and leaving notes on windshields, trying to buy cars. They even began using orange-painted AMC ambassadors and miniatures just to keep the unsanctioned stunts going. This was a huge problem of supply and demand. The show that made the Charger a household name was also the primary cause of its scarcity today. The final termination, the electric erasure. Today, we are witnessing the final termination of the era. The internal combustion V8 is no longer the target of insurance companies or oil sheiks. It is being silenced by a global shift toward electrification. The announcement of the electric Charger Daytona was the final erasure for many enthusiasts. The unsanctioned roar of the Hemi is being replaced by the hum of high voltage batteries. It is a mechanical vendetta, born of necessity, but it feels like a termination of the soul of Detroit. The engineers are still trying to fight back. They are adding illegal levels of torque and fake exhaust notes to simulate the unsanctioned power of the past. But you cannot replicate the mechanical conflict of a high compression big block with software. The era of the Vendetta is moving into the history books. The legacy of the unauthorized power. We didn't build these cars to be sensible. We didn't build them to be quiet. We built them to win a vendetta that started in the boardrooms and ended on the asphalt. These unsanctioned machines were the product of an illegal ambition to be faster than the law, faster than the competition, and faster than the previous year. They were problems that cost millions and protests against the status quo. The termination of the internal combustion engine is coming, but the story of the V8 will never be silenced. As long as someone, somewhere, is willing to risk everything for a few seconds of prohibited speed, the war for Detroit's soul will never truly be over.